The fluorescent lights in room 237 at Lincoln Middle School cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor, creating an atmosphere that seemed to mirror the tension hanging heavy in the air. 12-year-old Marcus Thompson sat hunched over his desk in the third row. His shoulders curved inward like a shield against the world. His pencil moved mechanically across the worksheet, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating how many minutes remained before he could escape Mrs. Helena Richardson's 8th grade English class. Mrs. Richardson stood at the front of the classroom, her sharp heels clicking against the floor with each measured step. At 53, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent 3 decades commanding respect through fear rather than inspiration. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her steel-grey eyes swept across the room like a predator surveying its territory. Today, like most days, those eyes seemed to linger longest on Marcus. "Mr. Thompson," her voice cut through the classroom chatter like a blade, causing several students to flinch. "I trust you're actually working on the assignment and not daydreaming as usual." The words dripped with condescension, and Marcus felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up his neck. 26 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some filled with sympathy, others with relief that they weren't the target. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now, let's begin. Marcus nodded silently, his voice caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. He had learned months ago that speaking up only made things worse. Mrs. Richardson thrived on confrontation, feeding off the discomfort of her students like a vampire drawing strength from blood. She had a particular talent for identifying the most vulnerable in her classroom, and Marcus, with his quiet demeanor and artistic soul, had become her favorite prey. "I asked you a question, Mr. Thompson. In this classroom, we use our words." Her voice rose slightly, causing Marcus to shrink further into his seat. The other students shifted uncomfortably, their attention divided between their worksheets and the unfolding drama. This had become a daily ritual, as predictable as the morning announcements and just as unwelcome. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning unit that rattled in the corner of the room. "What was that? I didn't hear you." Mrs. Richardson moved closer to his desk, her presence looming over him like a storm cloud. The scent of her perfume, sharp and floral, mixed with the chalk dust that seemed to permanently hang in the air of the old classroom. "Yes, ma'am, I'm working on the assignment," Marcus repeated, this time loud enough for the entire class to hear. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his pencil, and he could feel the familiar sting of tears threatening to surface. He blinked rapidly, forcing them back. Crying in Mrs. Richardson's class was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "Good. See that you continue to do so. Perhaps if you applied yourself with half the effort you put into those silly drawings, you might actually amount to something." The comment hit its mark with surgical precision. Mrs. Richardson had noticed Marcus's artistic talents early in the year, not to encourage them, but to use them as ammunition. She had a way of taking what students loved most and twisting it into a weapon against them. The rest of the class period dragged on with excruciating slowness. Mrs. Richardson continued her rounds, offering curt corrections and backhanded compliments to other students, but Marcus remained her primary focus. Every few minutes, she would find a reason to call attention to him. His posture was wrong, his handwriting was sloppy, his answers lacked depth. The criticism felt endless, each comment adding another weight to the invisible burden Marcus carried on his thin shoulders. As the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the period, students began gathering their belongings with barely contained eagerness. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, hoping to blend into the crowd and escape unnoticed. But Mrs. Richardson's voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Thompson, a word." The classroom emptied quickly, leaving Marcus alone with the woman who had made his life miserable for the past 6 months. She sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled as she regarded him with those cold, calculating eyes. "Your performance in this class continues to disappoint me," she began, her voice taking on a tone of false concern that Marcus had learned to recognize and dread. "I've been teaching for 30 years, and I can tell when a student simply isn't trying. You have potential, Marcus, but potential means nothing without effort." Marcus stood before her desk, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his backpack clutched tightly against his chest like armor. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was trying, that he spent hours each night on her assignments, that her constant criticism made it impossible to concentrate. But the words wouldn't come. "I expect to see improvement, and I expect it soon. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to contact your mother again. I'm sure she wouldn't be pleased to hear that her son is wasting everyone's time." The threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Marcus's mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs to support them both since his father had left 3 years ago. The last thing Marcus wanted was to add to her stress. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, his voice hollow with defeat. "You may go, Mrs." Richardson dismissed him with a wave of her hand, already turning her attention to the stack of papers on her desk, as if Marcus had ceased to exist the moment she finished with him. Marcus fled the classroom, his heart pounding as he navigated the crowded hallways toward his locker. Other students laughed and chatted around him, their voices blending into a cacophony of normalcy that felt foreign and unreachable. He twisted the combination on his locker with shaking fingers, grabbed his science textbook, and slammed the metal door shut with more force than necessary. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of equations and historical dates, but Marcus's mind remained trapped in room 237. He replayed every moment of the encounter, analyzing each word and gesture for clues about what he might have done differently. The rational part of his brain knew that Mrs. Richardson's behavior wasn't his fault, but the wounded child inside him wondered if maybe, somehow, it was. As the final bell rang and students streamed toward the exit, Marcus made his way to his usual spot in the school courtyard. He pulled out his sketchbook, the one Mrs. Richardson had mocked so cruelly, and began to draw. His pencil moved across the paper with practiced strokes, creating a world where words couldn't hurt, and teachers smiled instead of sneered. In his drawings, he found the peace that eluded him in the classroom, a sanctuary that even Mrs. Richardson couldn't invade. But as he sat there, sketching beneath the autumn sun, Marcus had no way of knowing that forces were already in motion that would soon change everything. His mother, Sarah Thompson, had been watching her son's gradual withdrawal with growing concern, and she had finally decided it was time to take action. Sarah Thompson stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water as she mechanically washed the dinner dishes. Through the window above the sink, she could see Marcus sitting at the small patio table in their backyard, hunched over his sketchbook in the fading evening light. It was a sight that had become increasingly common over the past few months, and it filled her with a mixture of pride and worry that sat heavy in her chest. The pride came from watching her son's artistic talent flourish, despite everything they had been through. Even as a single mother working double shifts at the diner and weekend hours at the grocery store, Sarah recognized something special in Marcus's drawings. His sketches had evolved from simple cartoon characters to complex landscapes and portraits that captured emotions with startling clarity. But it was the worry that dominated her thoughts as she watched him retreat further into his art, using it as a shield against a world that seemed determined to wound him. "Marcus, honey, it's getting dark. Come inside," she called through the open window. her voice carrying the gentle authority of a mother who had learned to balance firmness with compassion. Marcus looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes meeting hers through the glass, and she saw something there that made her heart ache. It was a weariness that no 12-year-old should carry, a resignation that spoke of battles fought and lost in silence. "Just a few more minutes, Mum," he replied, his voice soft, but tinged with a pleading quality that she couldn't ignore. Sarah dried her hands on the dish towel and stepped outside, the cool October air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. She sat down across from Marcus at the small wrought-iron table, noting how his posture immediately became more guarded. His shoulders drew inward, and his hand moved protectively over his sketchbook, as if shielding it from potential criticism. The gesture broke her heart, because she recognized it as a learned response, a defense mechanism that hadn't existed 6 months ago. "What are you working on?" she asked, keeping her voice light and interested. Marcus hesitated for a moment, before reluctantly sliding the sketchbook toward her. The drawing showed a lone figure standing on a cliff overlooking a turbulent sea, the person's face turned away from the viewer, but their posture conveying a profound sense of isolation and longing. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, and she meant it. The technique was impressive for someone his age, but more than that, the emotion captured in the simple lines and shadows spoke to something deeper. "You've really improved. Have you shown this to your art teacher?" Marcus shook his head quickly. "Mrs. Patterson left last month, remember? They haven't replaced her yet." His voice carried a note of loss that made Sarah realize how much that art class had meant to him. It had been one of the few bright spots in his school day, a place where his talent was recognized and celebrated rather than dismissed. "Right, I forgot." Sarah studied her son's face in the growing twilight, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his clothes seemed to hang looser on his frame. "Marcus, I've been thinking, how are things going in your other classes? You haven't talked much about school lately." She watched as his entire body tensed, his fingers gripping the pencil so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It was the reaction she had been dreading but expecting. Confirmation that her growing suspicions were founded in reality rather than maternal paranoia. "They're fine," he said quickly, too quickly. "Everything's fine, Mum. I'm just tired." "Honey, look at me." Sarah reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "I'm your mother. I know when everything is not fine. You've been different lately. Quieter, more withdrawn. You barely eat dinner, and I hear you talking in your sleep. Something is wrong and I need you to tell me what it is." Marcus's lower lip began to tremble, and Sarah saw him fighting a battle between his desire to protect her from worry and his need to share the burden he was carrying. She waited patiently, knowing that pushing too hard would only cause him to retreat further into himself. "It's Mrs. Richardson," he finally whispered, his voice so quiet that Sarah had to lean forward to hear him. She doesn't like me. I don't know why, but nothing I do is ever good enough for her. She calls on me all the time, makes me feel stupid in front of everyone, and she says things about my drawings, like they're a waste of time." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had burst inside him. Sarah felt a white-hot surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral, not wanting to frighten Marcus back into silence. She had suspected that something was happening at school, but hearing it confirmed still hit her like a physical blow. "What kinds of things does she say?" Sarah asked carefully, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. Marcus looked down at his sketchbook, his finger tracing the edge of the paper. "She tells me I'm not trying hard enough, that I'm wasting everyone's time. She makes me answer questions when she knows I don't know the answer, and then she acts like I'm stupid when I get it wrong. Yesterday, she told the whole class that maybe if I spent less time on silly drawings and more time on actual work, I might amount to something. Each word was like a knife twisting in Sarah's heart. She had worked so hard to build her son's confidence after his father had walked out, telling Marcus daily that he was talented and smart and worthy of love. To think that a teacher, someone who was supposed to nurture and encourage students, was systematically tearing him down, made her want to march to the school immediately and confront this Mrs. Richardson. "Has this been going on all year?" Sarah asked, fighting to keep her voice calm. Marcus nodded miserably. "It started at the beginning of the school year. At first I thought maybe she was just strict, but it's different with me. She's nice to other kids, but with me it's like she can't stand me." Sarah reached across the table and pulled Marcus into a hug, feeling how thin he had become under her embrace. "Sweetheart, I am so sorry this has been happening to you. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to worry you," Marcus mumbled against her shoulder. "You work so hard and you're always tired. I thought maybe I could handle it on my own, or maybe it would get better." The selflessness of his response only made Sarah's heart break further. At 12 years old, Marcus was already trying to protect her, sacrificing his own well-being to spare her additional stress. It was a burden no child should carry, and Sarah knew in that moment that she had to take action. "Listen to me carefully," she said, holding Marcus at arm's length so she could look directly into his eyes. "You are not responsible for protecting me from your problems. That's my job as your mother, and what this teacher is doing to you is not okay. It's not normal and it's not your fault." Marcus's eyes filled with tears that he had been holding back for months. "But what if she's right? What if I'm really not smart enough or good enough? What if I really am wasting everyone's time?" "Marcus Thompson, you look at me right now." Sarah's voice carried a fierce intensity that made her son's eyes widen. "You are brilliant and talented and kind. You have a gift that most people would kill for, and your art brings joy to everyone who sees it. This teacher, whoever she is wrong about you, dead wrong, and I'm going to make sure she knows it." "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, fear creeping into his voice. "I'm going to have a conversation with Mrs. Richardson," Sarah said, her jaw set with determination. "And then I'm going to have a conversation with the principal. This stops now." That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Sarah sat at her laptop researching everything she could find about bullying in schools, teacher misconduct, and her rights as a parent. She read horror stories of other children who had suffered similar treatment, and she read about the long-term psychological damage that could result from sustained emotional abuse by authority figures. As the hours passed and her anger crystallized into resolve, Sarah began formulating a plan. She would not let her son continue to suffer in silence. She would not stand by while some bitter teacher destroyed his confidence and crushed his spirit. Tomorrow, she would take the first day off from work that she had taken in over a year, and she would pay a visit to Lincoln Middle School. But Sarah had no idea that her planned confrontation would uncover secrets that would shock not just her, but the entire school community. Sometimes the most dramatic reversals begin with a mother's love and a determination to protect her child at all costs. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m., but Sarah Thompson had been awake for hours. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as scenarios played out in her mind, like scenes from a movie she couldn't turn off. Each imagined conversation with Mrs. Richardson grew more heated, each potential response more cutting. By the time pale light began filtering through her bedroom curtains, Sarah had mentally rehearsed the confrontation a dozen times. She moved quietly through her morning routine, not wanting to wake Marcus before necessary. In the bathroom mirror, She studied her reflection with the critical eye of someone preparing for battle. At 34, Sarah carried the weariness of someone who had been fighting uphill battles for most of her adult life. Her brown hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail for her shifts at the diner, hung loose around her shoulders. She chose her clothes carefully, a navy blue blazer she had bought for parent-teacher conferences, pressed slacks, and her most professional-looking shoes. She wanted to look like someone who commanded respect, not dismissed. As she applied a thin layer of makeup, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her manager at the diner. "Everything okay? You never call in sick." Sarah had fabricated a minor illness to explain her absence, not wanting to reveal the real reason and risk her job. She typed back quickly, "Just need the day. We'll be in tomorrow for sure." The sound of Marcus moving around in his room drew her attention. She could hear the familiar routine, the creaking of floorboards as he stumbled to his dresser, the rustling of clothes being selected with the careful consideration of someone who had learned that even small choices could draw unwanted attention. Sarah's heart clenched as she realized how much thought her 12-year-old son put into simply getting dressed each morning. "Marcus, breakfast," she called softly, heading to the kitchen to prepare what had become their standard morning fare. Toast, orange juice, and whatever fruit was on sale at the grocery store. This morning it was bananas, slightly overripe but still sweet. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his school backpack already slung over one shoulder. He had developed a habit of being ready to leave at a moment's notice, as if staying in any one place too long might invite disaster. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, despite obvious attempts to tame it, and his Superman t-shirt hung loose on his increasingly thin frame. "You're dressed up," he observed, his eyes taking in Sarah's unusual attire with the sharp awareness that children develop when their world becomes unpredictable. "I'm going to take care of that situation we talked about yesterday," Sarah said, setting his plate on the small table. She watched as Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: hope, fear, anxiety, and finally a resigned acceptance that made him look far older than his years. "Mom, maybe we should just leave it alone," Marcus said quietly, picking at his toast without really eating. "It's only until June. I can handle it." Sarah sat down across from him, reaching over to still his restless hands. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't have to handle it. That's not how school is supposed to work. Teachers are supposed to help you learn and grow, not make you feel small and worthless. But what if making a big deal about it makes everything worse?" The question carried the weight of experience beyond his years, and Sarah realized that her son had already learned lessons about power and consequences that broke her heart. "Then we'll deal with that too," Sarah said firmly. "But Marcus, what's happening to you isn't okay. If we don't stand up to bullies, they never stop. And yes, sometimes teachers can be bullies too." Marcus nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. She understood it completely. For a child, teachers represented absolute authority, and challenging that authority felt dangerous and potentially catastrophic. But Sarah also knew that her son's emotional well-being hung in the balance, and she refused to let Mrs. Richardson continue her campaign of psychological warfare. After dropping Marcus off at school, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot for several minutes, gathering her courage. The school building loomed before her, a sprawling brick structure that had been built in the 1970s and showed its age in the cracked concrete walkways and patched roof. She had attended this same school as a child, though it had been updated and expanded since then. The memories weren't particularly pleasant. Sarah had been a quiet kid from a poor family, often overlooked by teachers who focused their attention on more vocal or privileged students. But this wasn't about her past experiences. This was about her son's future, and Sarah would be damned if she let some bitter teacher destroy Marcus's love of learning the way her own enthusiasm had been slowly eroded decades ago. The main office buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of any school morning. Phones rang, teachers signed in late, and students with various ailments or forgotten lunch money waited in plastic chairs along the wall. Sarah approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair looked up with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who dealt with parents, students, and crises on a daily basis. "I'm Sarah Thompson, Marcus Thompson's mother. I need to speak with Mrs. Richardson about some concerns I have regarding my son's experience in her class," Sarah said, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, and Sarah caught something in her expression, a flicker of recognition or understanding that suggested she wasn't the first parent to make such a request. "Let me check Mrs. Richardson's schedule. She has a planning period, third hour." "Would 10:15 work for you?" Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 8:30 a.m., which gave her nearly 2 hours to either calm down or work herself into a more righteous fury. "That would be perfect. Should I wait here or—" "You're welcome to wait in our parent conference room," the receptionist said, leading Sarah down a short hallway to a small room furnished with a round table and several chairs. The walls were decorated with student artwork and motivational posters that proclaimed things like, "Every child can learn," and "Respect is a two-way street." The irony of those messages wasn't lost on Sarah. Alone in the conference room, Sarah pulled out her phone and began typing notes about everything Marcus had told her, organizing her thoughts and concerns into a coherent presentation. She had learned from years of dealing with bureaucracy at various jobs that preparation was key to being taken seriously. She couldn't rely on emotion alone, no matter how justified her anger might be. At exactly 10:15, the conference room door opened, and Mrs. Helena Richardson walked in. Sarah's first impression was of a woman who wielded authority like a weapon, ramrod straight posture, severe clothing, and eyes that seemed to catalogue and judge everything they saw. Mrs. Richardson's gaze swept over Sarah with barely concealed disdain, taking in the carefully chosen professional attire with a look that suggested she wasn't impressed. "Mrs. Thompson, I assume," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice carrying the clipped tones of someone who had better things to do. "I understand you have some concerns about Marcus." Sarah stood and extended her hand, which Mrs. Richardson shook briefly and without warmth. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Yes, I have some very serious concerns about how my son is being treated in your classroom." Mrs. Richardson settled into her chair with practiced ease, folding her hands on the table in a gesture that somehow managed to be both professional and condescending. "I'm always happy to discuss student progress with parents. Marcus is certainly a unique challenge." The way she said "unique challenge" made Sarah's jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What exactly do you mean by that, Mrs. Richardson?" "Well, as I'm sure you're aware, Marcus has some attention issues. He seems more interested in doodling than in paying attention to instruction. His participation in class discussions is minimal at best, and his work often lacks the effort I expect from my students." Mrs. Richardson's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a child's academic and emotional well-being. Sarah felt her carefully planned composure begin to crack. "Mrs. Richardson, my son tells me that you single him out for criticism regularly, that you mock his artistic interests, and that you make him feel stupid in front of his classmates. Is that your idea of motivating a student to improve?" Mrs. Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly, and something cold flickered in her grey eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you'll find that children often exaggerate when they're looking for sympathy at home. Marcus is a perfectly average student who could benefit from more discipline and less coddling. Perhaps if he faced more challenges at home, he would be better prepared for the realities of academic life. The comment was a direct attack on Sarah's parenting, and it landed like a slap across her face. But instead of backing down, Sarah felt her protective instincts roar to life. This woman had been systematically destroying her son's confidence for months, and now she had the audacity to suggest that Sarah was to blame. "Mrs. Richardson," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about why I'm here today. I'm not here to discuss my parenting or to listen to you make excuses for bullying my child. I'm here to inform you that your treatment of Marcus stops today." The temperature in the small conference room seemed to drop 10 degrees as two strong-willed women faced off across a table, each convinced of their righteousness, neither prepared for what was about to unfold. Mrs. Richardson's laugh was sharp and humorless, the sound echoing off the walls of the small conference room like breaking glass. "Bullying?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been teaching for 30 years. I think I know the difference between appropriate classroom management and bullying. What you're describing sounds like a child who doesn't like being held accountable for his lack of effort." Sarah felt heat rise in her chest, spreading upward until her entire face flushed with anger. But she had learned long ago that losing control would only undermine her position, so she kept her voice steady, even as her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Accountability doesn't involve humiliating a student in front of his peers or dismissing his talents as worthless. When you tell a child that his artwork is a waste of time, when you call on him specifically to embarrass him, when you make him feel like he doesn't belong in your classroom, that's not teaching, Mrs. Richardson. That's cruelty. "I think you're being overly dramatic, Mrs. Richardson replied, but Sarah caught a flicker of something in the teacher's expression, not remorse but irritation at being challenged. "Marcus needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around his artistic interests. Art is a nice hobby, but it won't serve him well in the real world. I'm trying to prepare him for reality." The condescension in her tone was so thick it was almost tangible, and Sarah realized that this woman genuinely believed she was justified in her treatment of Marcus. There was no recognition that a 12-year-old child deserved to be treated with basic human dignity, no acknowledgement that creativity and artistic expression had any value. In Mrs. Richardson's worldview, conformity was king, and anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of an ideal student deserved whatever treatment they received. "Whose reality?" Sarah asked, leaning forward in her chair. "The reality where children are taught that their gifts don't matter, where being different is something to be ashamed of. Mrs. Richardson, you're not preparing my son for the real world. You're teaching him that the world is a cruel place where authority figures can't be trusted." "Perhaps he's learning an important lesson then," Mrs. Richardson said coolly. "Not everyone in life will appreciate his unique qualities. Better he learns that now than face disappointment later." The casual cruelty of the statement took Sarah's breath away. She stared at the woman across from her, trying to comprehend how someone who had chosen to work with children could be so fundamentally lacking in empathy. "Do you even remember why you became a teacher?" Sarah asked quietly. Mrs. Richardson's posture stiffened. "I became a teacher to educate young minds and prepare them for productive futures. I have high standards, and I expect my students to meet them." "That's more than most children get these days." "High standards don't require destroying a child's spirit," Sarah replied. "You can challenge students while still treating them with respect. You can have expectations while still acknowledging their individual strengths. What you're doing to Marcus isn't about high standards, it's about power." I think this conversation has run its course, Mrs. Richardson said, starting to rise from her chair. If you have concerns about my teaching methods, you're welcome to speak with the principal. But I won't sit here and listen to unfounded accusations from a parent who clearly doesn't understand the challenges of classroom management. Sit down. Sarah's voice carried an authority that surprised even her. We're not finished. Mrs. Richardson paused, half standing, clearly taken aback by the command. For 30 years, she had been the one dismissing others, the one controlling conversations, the one deciding when interactions were over. Being ordered around by a parent, especially one she clearly viewed as beneath her, was foreign territory. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Richardson's voice was dangerously quiet. Sarah stood slowly, using her full height to her advantage. "I said, sit down. You've spent months making my son feel powerless in your classroom. You've made him dread coming to school. You've attacked his self-worth and dismissed his talents. You've turned what should be a place of learning into a place of fear. And now you want to walk away because you don't like being held accountable for your actions." The two women faced each other across the small table, the air between them crackling with tension. Mrs. Richardson remained half-standing, her face flushed with a combination of anger and something that might have been uncertainty. She was used to parents who deferred to her authority, who apologized for taking up her time, who accepted her assessment of their children without question. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you need to calm down," Mrs. Richardson said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "No, I don't think I do," Sarah replied evenly. "I think I need to be exactly as upset as I am. Because while I've been working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads, you've been systematically destroying my son's love of learning. While I've been building him up, telling him he's talented and special and worthy of respect, you've been tearing him down day after day." Sarah moved around the table, closing the distance between them. "Do you know what Marcus does when he comes home from your class? He draws. For hours. Do you know what he draws? Lonely figures standing apart from groups. Dark storms and empty landscapes. Children with their faces turned away. He's 12 years old, and he's already learned to see the world as a hostile place because of you." Mrs. Richardson finally sat back down, but her expression had hardened into something cold and defensive. "Children that age are naturally dramatic. You're reading too much into typical adolescent behavior." "Typical?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay controlled. "It's typical for a happy, outgoing child to become withdrawn and anxious? It's typical for a student who loves school to start having stomach aches every morning? Mrs. Richardson, what you call typical, I call the warning signs of a child being emotionally abused." The word abuse hung in the air between them like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Mrs. Richardson's face went pale, then flushed red. "How dare you? How dare you come into this school and make such accusations? I have never laid a hand on any student, and I resent the implication—" "Abuse isn't just physical," Sarah interrupted. "Emotional abuse is just as damaging, sometimes more so. When you make a child feel worthless, when you attack their interests and talents, when you use your position of authority to belittle and demean them, that's abuse, Mrs. Richardson. And the fact that you don't see it that way makes it even worse." The conference room door suddenly opened, and both women turned to see a tall man in his 50s standing in the doorway. His expression was concerned but controlled, the look of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, his gaze moving between Sarah and Mrs. Richardson. "I'm Principal Martinez." I could hear raised voices from down the hall. Sarah felt a moment of embarrassment at having lost her composure, but she quickly pushed it aside. If anything, having the principal here might work in her favor. "Actually, Mr. Martinez, I'm glad you're here. I'm Sarah Thompson. Marcus Thompson's mother and I need to report some very serious concerns about my son's treatment in Mrs. Richardson's classroom. Principal Martinez stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly," he said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Mrs. Richardson, would you like to explain what's happening here?" Mrs. Richardson straightened in her chair, quickly assuming the role of the wronged professional. "Mr. Martinez, I was simply trying to discuss Marcus's academic performance with his mother when she became hostile and began making wild accusations about my teaching methods. I think she may be having some personal issues that are affecting her judgment. The subtle attack on Sarah's mental state was masterfully delivered, designed to undermine her credibility while positioning Mrs. Richardson as the reasonable adult in the room. But Sarah had spent too many years being dismissed and marginalized to let it slide. "Mr. Martinez," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "my son has been coming home from school for months, telling me about how Mrs. Richardson singles him out for criticism, mocks his artistic interests, and makes him feel stupid in front of his classmates. When I tried to discuss this with her professionally, she dismissed my concerns and suggested that Marcus was lying to gain sympathy. When I pressed the issue, she accused me of being overdramatic and said that maybe Marcus needed to learn that the world is cruel." Principal Martinez looked between the two women, his expression unreadable. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Richardson, how do you respond to these concerns?" But before Mrs. Richardson could answer, Sarah realized that she had reached a decision point. She could continue this three-way conversation, hope that the principal would take her seriously, and risk having her concerns dismissed as the complaints of an overprotective parent, or she could take a more direct approach. "Mr. Martinez, I want to observe Mrs. Richardson's class," Sarah said suddenly. "I want to see for myself how she interacts with my son and the other students. I think that would clear up any questions about whether my concerns are justified." The request seemed to catch both educators off guard. Mrs. Richardson's face went pale, then flushed red again. "That's highly irregular," she said quickly. "Classroom observations require advance notice, proper procedures." "Actually," Principal Martinez interrupted, "parents do have the right to observe their child's classroom environment, provided it doesn't disrupt the educational process. Mrs. Thompson, when would you like to conduct this observation?" Sarah could see panic flickering in Mrs. Richardson's eyes, and she knew she had struck the right chord. "Today. Right now, if possible. I believe Mrs. Richardson has Marcus's class next period." That's not possible," Mrs. Richardson stammered. "We have a test today. Parent observations during testing would be completely inappropriate." But Principal Martinez was already checking his tablet. "According to the lesson plans you submitted, Mrs. Richardson, you have a literature discussion scheduled for 6th period, not a test. I think a brief observation would be perfectly appropriate." Sarah felt a surge of triumph mixed with apprehension. She was about to see firsthand what Marcus endured every day, and part of her was terrified that it might be even worse than she had imagined. At 1:47 p.m., Sarah Thompson sat in a small plastic chair at the back of room 237, her heart pounding as she watched students file in for 6th period English. She had spent the intervening hours in the principal's office, discussing her concerns in more detail and learning about the formal complaint process. Principal Martinez had been diplomatic but concerned, especially when Sarah mentioned that other parents might have similar issues they hadn't reported. The classroom looked different from an adult's perspective than it had in her imagination. The fluorescent light seemed harsher, casting everything in an unflattering glare that made even the brightest student artwork on the walls appear faded and lifeless. The desks were arranged in rigid rows, facing forward toward Mrs. Richardson's command center at the front of the room. There was something militaristic about the setup that made Sarah uncomfortable. Mrs. Richardson had been professionally cordial when Sarah entered the classroom, greeting her with a tight smile and gesturing to the observation chair. "Please feel free to take notes," she had said, her tone suggesting that she had nothing to hide. But Sarah noticed the way the teacher's hands trembled slightly as she organized papers on her desk, and how her eyes kept darting toward the clock as if counting down to some dreaded event. Marcus was one of the last students to enter the classroom, and Sarah's heart broke a little when she saw how his entire demeanor changed the moment he crossed the threshold. Outside in the hallway, she had glimpsed him laughing with a friend, his face animated and alive. But stepping into room 237 was like watching him put on armor, his shoulders hunched, his head lowered, his vibrant personality dimming until he became almost invisible. He spotted Sarah immediately, his eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and mortification. She gave him a small, encouraging smile and a subtle thumbs up, hoping to convey that she was there to help, not to embarrass him further. Marcus nodded slightly, then quickly took his seat in the third row, pulling out his notebook with the careful precision of someone who had learned that even small movements could draw unwanted attention. "Class, we have a visitor today, Mrs. Richardson announced as the bell rang. "Mrs. Thompson is observing our classroom as part of our school's parent engagement program." The lie was delivered smoothly, making Sarah's presence sound routine rather than the result of a formal complaint. Several students turned to look at Sarah with mild curiosity before returning their attention to the front of the room. "Today we're discussing symbolism in The Outsiders, Mrs. Richardson continued, writing the topic on the whiteboard with sharp, aggressive strokes. "I hope everyone completed the reading assignment, though I suspect some of you found more interesting things to do with your time." The comment was delivered to the class as a whole, but Sarah noticed how Mrs. Richardson's gaze lingered on Marcus as she spoke. It was subtle. Anyone not specifically watching for it might have missed it. But to Sarah, it felt like a predator selecting prey from a herd. "Let's start with an easy question," Mrs. Richardson said, her tone suggesting that whatever followed would be anything but easy. "The sunset scene in Chapter 3 contains important symbolic elements. Who can identify one symbol and explain its significance?" Several hands shot up around the room, but Mrs. Richardson ignored them all, her gaze sweeping the classroom before landing with laser precision on Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, since you seem so absorbed in your notebook, perhaps you'd like to share your insights on the symbolism of the sunset." Sarah watched her son's face drain of color. His notebook was open to his assigned reading notes, not drawings as Mrs. Richardson's comment implied, but the accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus looked up slowly, his voice barely audible when he spoke. The sunset represents the bridge between the two worlds, the rich kids and the poor kids." It was actually a thoughtful interpretation, Sarah realized, and several other students nodded in recognition. But Mrs. Richardson's expression suggested she had been hoping for failure rather than success. "That's a very simplistic reading, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying a condescending tone that made Sarah's jaw clench. "Anyone else care to offer a more sophisticated analysis?" A girl in the front row raised her hand eagerly. "The sunset symbolizes the universal experiences that transcend social class boundaries," she said. "It shows that despite their differences, Ponyboy and Cherry can appreciate the same beauty." "Excellent, Jennifer," Mrs. Richardson beamed, her voice warm and encouraging in a way it had never been when addressing Marcus. "That demonstrates real critical thinking skills. You see, class, it's not enough to identify a symbol. You must understand its deeper meaning and how it connects to the author's larger themes. The contrast in treatment was so stark that Sarah felt physically nauseated. Jennifer's answer was essentially the same as Marcus's, just delivered with more sophisticated vocabulary, yet one was praised while the other was dismissed as simplistic. Sarah began furiously scribbling notes, documenting not just what was said, but the tone, body language, and obvious favoritism on display. The lesson continued, and Sarah watched a masterclass in psychological manipulation unfold before her eyes. Mrs. Richardson called on Marcus 3 more times during the 45-minute period, each time asking questions that seemed designed to highlight his weaknesses rather than build on his strengths. When he answered correctly, his responses were dismissed as obvious or incomplete. When he struggled, Mrs. Richardson would let the silence stretch uncomfortably before moving on to another student who would provide the answer Marcus couldn't. But it wasn't just the direct interactions that were troubling. Sarah noticed how Mrs. Richardson positioned herself physically when moving around the classroom, standing close to students she favored, creating distance from those she didn't. How her voice changed depending on who she was addressing, becoming warmer and more encouraging with some students, while remaining cold and critical with others. How she used subtle facial expressions and body language to convey approval or disapproval, creating an atmosphere where certain students felt welcomed, while others felt tolerated at best. 20 minutes into the observation, Marcus raised his hand to answer a question about character motivation. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her son volunteer to participate, despite the hostile environment. But Mrs. Richardson looked right through him, calling instead on a student whose hand had gone up after Marcus's. "Anyone else?" Mrs. Richardson asked, when that student finished answering, her gaze deliberately avoiding the area where Marcus sat with his hand still raised. Sarah watched her son's face crumple slightly before he slowly lowered his hand. It was a small moment, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, but Sarah realized she was witnessing the daily erosion of her child's confidence in real time. This wasn't dramatic abuse that would leave visible scars. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a systematic campaign to make Marcus feel invisible and worthless. The final straw came near the end of class when Mrs. Richardson assigned a creative writing project. "I want you to write a short story that incorporates at least 3 symbolic elements we've discussed today," she announced. "This is an opportunity to demonstrate your understanding of literary techniques while exercising your creativity." A boy near the front raised his hand. "Mrs. Richardson, can we include drawings or illustrations with our stories?" "Certainly, David. Visual elements can enhance storytelling when used thoughtfully." She paused, her gaze finding Marcus again. "However, I want to emphasize that this is a writing assignment, not an art project. The words should carry the meaning, not serve as an excuse for doodling." The comment was ostensibly directed at the entire class, but everyone understood who the real target was. Sarah watched Marcus sink lower in his seat, his face burning with embarrassment. Several of his classmates glanced at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to second-hand discomfort. As the bell rang and students began gathering their belongings, Sarah remained seated, processing what she had witnessed. It was somehow worse than she had imagined because it was so insidious. An outside observer might dismiss most of what she had seen as normal classroom interactions, but the pattern was unmistakable when viewed as a whole, a sustained campaign of psychological pressure designed to break down one specific student. Marcus lingered at his desk, clearly torn between wanting to escape and needing to speak with his mother. Sarah caught his eye and nodded toward the hallway, indicating that she would meet him outside. As the last students filed out, Sarah found herself alone with Mrs. Richardson for the second time that day. "Well?" Mrs. Richardson said, her voice artificially bright. "I hope that was illuminating for you. As you can see, I treat all my students fairly and have high expectations for everyone." Sarah stood slowly, her notebook clutched in her hand like evidence at a crime scene. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but filled with a cold fury that made Mrs. Richardson take an involuntary step backward. "You're right," Sarah said. "That was very illuminating indeed." Principal Martinez's office felt smaller with 3 adults crowded around his desk, the tension in the room so thick it seemed to absorb sound. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her observation notes spread before her like battle plans, while Mrs. Richardson maintained her defensive posture in the seat beside her. Principal Martinez reviewed Sarah's handwritten documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, these are very detailed observations," he said finally, his voice measured and professional. "You've documented specific times, exact quotes, and behavioral patterns." "Mrs. Richardson, I have to say I'm concerned about some of these incidents." Mrs. Richardson shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence visibly wavering. "Mr. Martinez, you have to understand that classroom management requires different approaches for different students. Marcus is a challenging child who requires more structure and redirection than others. What Mrs. Thompson is interpreting as unfair treatment is simply individualized instruction." "Individualized instruction?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "Is that what you call ignoring a student's raised hand? Is that what you call making comments designed to embarrass him in front of his peers? Because I watched you call on Jennifer immediately when she raised her hand, but somehow you couldn't see Marcus when he was sitting 3 feet closer to you." Principal Martinez held up a hand to prevent the confrontation from escalating further. "Let me be clear about something, Mrs. Richardson. I've been reviewing Marcus's academic records while you two were in class. His grades in your class have dropped significantly compared to his performance in other subjects. His previous teachers describe him as engaged and creative, yet you've characterized him as unmotivated and disruptive. That discrepancy concerns me." Sarah felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by sadness for all the months Marcus had suffered in silence. "Mr. Martinez, may I ask if other parents have expressed concerns about Mrs. Richardson's teaching methods?" The principal hesitated, and in that pause, Sarah saw the answer she was looking for. "We take all parent concerns seriously," he said diplomatically, "but I can't discuss specific complaints about other students." "But there have been others," Sarah pressed. "This isn't an isolated incident, is it?" Mrs. Richardson's face had gone pale. "This is a witch hunt," she said, her voice rising slightly. "One parent makes unfounded accusations and suddenly everything I've done in my 30-year career is under scrutiny. I've dedicated my life to education, and I won't sit here and be character assassinated by someone who doesn't understand the challenges of classroom management." 30 years, Sarah repeated slowly. 30 years of treating children the way you treated my son today. How many Marcus Thompsons have sat in your classroom over the years? How many bright, creative kids have you convinced that they're not good enough? The question hit its mark. Mrs. Richardson's composure finally cracked, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Not remorse, but a kind of desperate defensiveness that spoke to years of accumulated resentment. "You think teaching is easy," Mrs. Richardson snapped. "You think dealing with entitled children and helicopter parents year after year is some kind of joy. I've watched education standards decline, seen respect for authority disappear, and been expected to perform miracles with increasingly difficult students, while parents blame teachers for every problem their children face." The outburst revealed more than Mrs. Richardson probably intended. Sarah realized she was looking at someone who had become bitter and cynical, who saw students not as individuals to nurture, but as adversaries to be controlled. It was both tragic and inexcusable. "Mrs. Richardson," Principal Martinez said quietly, "I think you need to take a step back and consider what you just said. These are children we're talking about, 12 and 13-year-olds who deserve to feel safe and supported in their classrooms." But Mrs. Richardson seemed unable to stop herself now that the floodgates had opened. "Safe and supported," she laughed harshly. "What about supporting teachers? What about the safety of educators who are constantly under attack from parents who think their precious children can do no wrong? Marcus Thompson is a mediocre student who would rather draw pictures than pay attention, and instead of addressing that at home, his mother comes in here making accusations and demands." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't you dare call my son mediocre. You don't know him. You've never tried to know him. You decided from day one that he didn't fit your narrow definition of an acceptable student, and you've spent months trying to break his spirit because of it." "Perhaps," came a new voice from the doorway, "we should hear from Marcus himself." All three adults turned to see Dr. Patricia Williams, the school district's superintendent, standing in the entrance to Principal Martinez's office. She was a tall, distinguished woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Behind her stood Marcus, his face pale but determined. "Dr. Williams," Principal Martinez said, rising quickly from his chair, "I wasn't expecting... I was in the building for another matter when I heard raised voices." "Dr. Williams said, stepping into the office. "Mr. Martinez filled me in on the situation. Marcus, would you like to tell us about your experience in Mrs. Richardson's class?" Sarah's heart raced as she watched her son step forward. She wanted to protect him from having to relive his traumatic experiences, but she also recognized that his voice needed to be heard. Marcus looked at each adult in turn before settling his gaze on Mrs. Richardson. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "why don't you like me?" The simple, direct question seemed to pierce through all the adult arguments and justifications, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Richardson's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as she struggled to respond. "Marcus, Dr. Williams said gently, "can you give us some specific examples of things that have happened in class that made you feel uncomfortable or upset?" Marcus took a deep breath, and Sarah could see him summoning courage she hadn't known he possessed. "She calls on me when she knows I don't know the answer, but when I do know the answer, she acts like it's wrong, even when other kids say the same thing. She makes comments about my drawing being a waste of time in front of everyone. Yesterday she said that maybe if I cared less about art and more about real work, I might amount to something." Sarah watched Mrs. Richardson's face during Marcus's recitation, and what she saw there wasn't denial or shock. It was the look of someone who had been caught in behavior they knew was wrong, but had convinced themselves was justified. "Marcus," Dr. Williams continued, "how do these interactions make you feel?" "Like I don't belong anywhere," Marcus said simply. "Like maybe she's right and I really am stupid. I used to love school, but now I just want to hide until it's over." The raw honesty in his words broke something inside Sarah. To hear her vibrant, creative son reduced to wanting to hide was almost unbearable, but it also filled her with fierce pride at his courage in speaking up. Dr. Williams turned to Mrs. Richardson, her expression grave. "Mrs. Richardson, these are very serious allegations. Do you have a response?" For a long moment, Mrs. Richardson said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was defensive but lacking its earlier fire. "I maintain high standards for all my students. If Marcus feels singled out, perhaps it's because he needs more guidance than others to reach those standards. That's not an answer, Dr. Williams said firmly. The question is whether you made disparaging comments about his artwork, whether you called on him specifically to embarrass him, and whether you treated him differently than other students. Those are yes or no questions, Mrs. Richardson. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Mrs. Richardson clearly wrestled with how to respond. Finally, she seemed to deflate slightly. Sometimes when you've been teaching as long as I have, you develop certain shortcuts in dealing with students who don't respond to conventional methods. Marcus is a bright boy, but he lacks focus. I may have been more direct in my attempts to redirect his attention. It wasn't a full confession, but it was close enough. Sarah saw Dr. Williams and Principal Martinez exchange meaningful glances. Mrs. Richardson, Dr. Williams said, I think we need to schedule a formal meeting to discuss this matter further. In the meantime, I'm going to arrange for Marcus to be transferred to Mrs. Patterson's class for the remainder of the year. But Mrs. Patterson is the art teacher, Sarah said, confused. She left last month. Dr. Williams smiled for the first time since entering the office. Actually, Mrs. Patterson just returned from her sabbatical yesterday. She'll be taking over a section of 8th grade English as well as resuming her art classes. I think Marcus might find her approach more compatible with his learning style. Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Marcus would have a teacher who understood and valued his artistic nature, someone who would build him up instead of tearing him down. But her relief was tempered by the knowledge that other students were still sitting in Mrs. Richardson's classroom, potentially enduring the same treatment. As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Williams addressed the elephant in the room. Mrs. Richardson, effective immediately. You'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into these allegations. We'll be conducting interviews with current and former students, reviewing your teaching practices, and determining the appropriate course of action. Mrs. Richardson's face went ashen. You can't do this to me. 30 years of service, and you're going to destroy my career over the complaints of one disgruntled parent. We're not destroying anything, Dr. Williams replied calmly. We're investigating allegations of inappropriate conduct towards students. If these allegations prove unfounded, you'll be reinstated with full pay for the time missed. If they prove accurate, we'll take appropriate disciplinary action. That's how the process works, Mrs. Richardson. As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for Marcus's immediate transfer, Sarah found herself face to face with Mrs. Richardson in the hallway outside the principal's office. The teacher's mask of professional composure had finally slipped completely, revealing someone who looked older and more fragile than she had just hours earlier. You have no idea what you've done, Mrs. Richardson said quietly. Teaching was all I had left. Sarah felt a momentary pang of sympathy for the broken woman before her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of her son's pain. Then, maybe you should have remembered that it was never about you, she replied. It was always supposed to be about the children. But as Sarah walked away with Marcus by her side, she had no idea that the investigation Dr. Williams had promised would uncover secrets that would shock not just the school, but the entire community. The dramatic reversal that had begun with a mother's determination to protect her son was about to become something much larger and more far-reaching than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks after Mrs. Richardson's suspension, Dr. Williams sat in her district office, surrounded by stacks of files, interview transcripts, and documentation that painted a disturbing picture spanning nearly a decade. What had begun as an investigation into one teacher's treatment of a single student had mushroomed into something far more complex and troubling. The phone calls had started almost immediately after word spread through the Lincoln Middle School community that Mrs. Richardson was under investigation. The first call came from Jennifer Chen's mother. I thought I was being oversensitive, Mrs. Chen had said, her voice shaky with emotion. Jennifer used to love writing, but after a few months in Mrs. Richardson's class, she became convinced she wasn't good at it. She would cry over her essays, saying they were stupid and worthless. I thought it was normal middle school drama, but after hearing about the Thompson situation, then came the Rodriguezes, whose son David had been in Mrs. Richardson's class 2 years prior. David started having panic attacks before English class, Mr. Rodriguez explained during his interview with Dr. Williams. He would beg us to let him stay home, said he felt sick every morning. We took him to doctors, therapists, had him tested for anxiety disorders. Never once did we think it might be his teacher causing the problem. The calls kept coming. The Washingtons, whose daughter Keisha had become so withdrawn in 7th grade that they had considered homeschooling. The Patel family, whose academically gifted son Raj had suddenly declared he was too stupid for advanced classes after a semester with Mrs. Richardson. The Johnsons, whose creative daughter Maya had thrown away all her poetry and announced she was done with writing forever. Dr. Williams had been an educator for over 40 years, and she thought she had seen everything. But the pattern emerging from the investigation was both systematic and heartbreaking. Mrs. Richardson hadn't been randomly cruel. She had been deliberately targeting specific types of students, the creative ones, the sensitive ones, the ones who didn't fit her rigid mold of what a successful student should look like. The breakthrough came when Dr. Williams interviewed Mrs. Patricia Patterson, the art teacher who had recently returned from sabbatical. Mrs. Patterson had worked at Lincoln Middle School for 15 years before taking her leave, and she had intimate knowledge of the school's culture and politics. I tried to address my concerns about Helena years ago, Mrs. Patterson explained during their private meeting in Dr. Williams' office. I noticed that many of my most talented art students would come to me in tears after English class. They would tell me that Mrs. Richardson had made comments about art being a waste of time, or that creative students were just avoiding real work. Dr. Williams leaned forward in her chair. Did you report these concerns to the administration? Mrs. Patterson's expression was pained. I tried. I spoke with the previous principal, Mr. Hendricks, multiple times, but Helena was, well, she was very good at covering her tracks. The students she targeted were often quiet kids who wouldn't speak up for themselves. And Helena had a way of making her criticism sound like academic rigor to administrators who weren't in her classroom every day. What changed? Why didn't you pursue it further? Honestly, I got tired of fighting a system that seemed designed to protect teachers rather than students. Helena had tenure, union support, and 30 years of service. I was told that unless I had concrete evidence of abuse, the kind that would hold up in court, there wasn't much that could be done. So I focused on being a safe haven for the kids in my art classes and tried to rebuild what Helena had torn down. The conversation with Mrs. Patterson led Dr. Williams to request Mrs. Richardson's personnel file, which revealed a troubling pattern that had been overlooked for years. While her official evaluations were generally positive, there was a steady stream of informal complaints that had been noted but never formally investigated. Parents had been told their concerns would be looked into, but there was no evidence that any meaningful action had ever been taken. More disturbing was the discovery that Mrs. Richardson's classroom had seen an unusually high rate of student transfers over the years. When Dr. Williams cross-referenced the transfer requests with academic records, she found that many of the students who had left Mrs. Richardson's class had seen immediate improvements in their English grades and overall school performance. The psychological evaluation that the district had ordered as part of the investigation provided additional insights. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a licensed educational psychologist, had conducted extensive interviews with Mrs. Richardson, as well as psychological testing. Her report, delivered confidentially to Dr. Williams painted a picture of someone who had become increasingly rigid and controlling over the years. Mrs. Richardson appears to have developed what I would characterize as an authoritarian teaching style that has gradually evolved into something more problematic, Dr. Martinez had written. She demonstrates a pattern of identifying students who challenge her sense of control, often creative, independent thinkers, and systematically undermining their confidence. This behavior appears to be unconscious, but deeply ingrained. The report went on to explain that Mrs. Richardson seemed to view student creativity and independence as personal threats to her authority. Rather than adapting her teaching methods to accommodate different learning styles, she had developed a zero-tolerance approach to anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of appropriate student behavior. Of particular concern, the report continued, is Mrs. Richardson's apparent inability to recognize the emotional impact of her actions on students. When confronted with specific examples of harmful behavior, she consistently justifies her actions as necessary for maintaining classroom discipline or preparing students for real-world challenges. Dr. Williams was reviewing this report for the third time when her secretary knocked on her door. "Dr. Williams, Mrs. Thompson is here for her appointment." Sarah entered the office looking tired but determined. Over the past 3 weeks, she had become an unofficial advocate for the other families affected by Mrs. Richardson's behavior, helping to coordinate their stories and supporting parents who were struggling to come forward with their own experiences. "How is Marcus adjusting to his new class?" Dr. Williams asked, as Sarah settled into the chair across from her desk. Sarah's face brightened for the first time since entering the office. "It's like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. Mrs. Patterson has him working on a creative writing project that incorporates visual art, and he's excited about school again. He actually asked me yesterday if he could get to class early to work on his story. I'm so glad to hear that, and I want you to know that your courage in coming forward has made a real difference." We've now documented similar patterns of behavior affecting 17 different students over the past 5 years alone. Sarah's expression grew serious. "What happens now? I know Mrs. Richardson is still on administrative leave, but what's the long-term plan?" Dr. Williams chose her words carefully. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, I'll be recommending to the school board that Mrs. Richardson's employment be terminated. The pattern of behavior we've documented represents a clear violation of professional standards and district policy regarding student welfare. Will she be able to get another teaching job somewhere else? That will depend on several factors. We'll be required to report our findings to the state licensing board, which could affect her teaching certification. But Sarah, I want you to understand something important. This situation never should have been allowed to continue for as long as it did." Sarah tilted her head, sensing there was more to the story. Dr. Williams continued, "Our investigation has revealed systematic failures in how complaints were handled in the past. Parents raised concerns, students exhibited clear signs of distress, and yet no meaningful action was taken. We failed these children, and we failed you as parents." The admission was both validating and heartbreaking for Sarah. "So what changes to prevent this from happening again?" "We're implementing a new system for handling student welfare concerns, including mandatory training for all administrators on recognizing signs of emotional abuse. We're also establishing an anonymous reporting system for students and parents, and we're changing our teacher evaluation process to include regular classroom observations focused specifically on student-teacher interactions." Sarah nodded, but Dr. Williams could see the skepticism in her eyes. "I know it's hard to trust the system after what your family has been through," Dr. Williams acknowledged. But I give you my word that we will do everything in our power to ensure this never happens again." As their meeting concluded, Dr. Williams found herself thinking about all the children who had suffered in silence over the years, their confidence eroded by an adult who was supposed to nurture their growth. The investigation had revealed not just one teacher's harmful behavior, but a system that had prioritized institutional protection over student welfare. But there was still one more revelation to come, one that would shake the Lincoln Middle School community to its core and prove that sometimes the most dramatic reversals come from the most unexpected places. The next morning, Dr. Williams received a call that would change everything they thought they knew about Mrs. Helena Richardson. The call came at 7:43 a.m. on a gray November morning, just as Dr. Williams was reviewing the final recommendations for Mrs. Richardson's dismissal. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky but determined, belonging to someone who had clearly spent sleepless nights debating whether to make this call. "Dr. Williams, this is Rebecca Richardson. I think we need to talk about my mother." Dr. Williams nearly dropped her coffee cup. In all the weeks of investigation, no one had mentioned that Mrs. Richardson had a daughter, let alone one who apparently had something important to share about the case. "Ms. Richardson, I appreciate you calling, but I should inform you that your mother's case is still under investigation, and anything you tell me could potentially be used in—" "I know," Rebecca interrupted. "I'm calling because of the investigation, not in spite of it. Dr. Williams, I was one of my mother's students 23 years ago, and I need you to know that what she did to those children, she's been doing for decades, including to me." An hour later, Rebecca Richardson sat in Dr. Williams's office, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. At 35, she bore a striking resemblance to her mother, the same sharp features, the same steel-grey eyes. But where Mrs. Richardson carried herself with rigid authority, Rebecca seemed folded in on herself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. "I became a teacher because of my mother," Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not because she inspired me, but because I wanted to be everything she wasn't. I wanted to be the teacher I needed when I was 12 years old and sitting in her classroom, watching her destroy other children the same way she had destroyed me at home." Dr. Williams listened in stunned silence as Rebecca recounted a childhood filled with impossible standards, constant criticism, and emotional manipulation that made her mother's classroom behavior seem almost mild by comparison. Helena Richardson, it seemed, had been practicing her techniques on her own daughter long before she ever stepped foot in a classroom. "She used to tell me that love had to be earned through perfect performance," Rebecca continued, tears streaming down her face. "Nothing I did was ever good enough. When I was 8, I painted her a picture for Mother's Day, spent weeks on it, thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever created. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before pointing out everything that was wrong with it. Then she hung it on the refrigerator upside down and left it that way for months." The parallels to Marcus's experience were chilling, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "When I was Marcus's age, 12 years old, I had to take my mother's English class. I thought maybe, finally, she would see me differently. Maybe in her classroom she would be proud of me." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "Instead, she was twice as hard on me as she was on any other student. She would call on me when she knew I didn't know the answer, then act disappointed when I failed. She would critique my essays in front of the entire class, pointing out every flaw as an example of what not to do." Dr. Williams felt sick to her stomach. "Rebecca, why didn't anyone intervene? Didn't your teachers notice what was happening?" Who was going to stand up to Helena Richardson? She was already becoming a powerful figure in the school district by then, and I was just one quiet kid who was obviously struggling with something, but nobody wanted to dig deep enough to find out what. Rebecca wiped her eyes with a tissue. Besides, she was very good at making her cruelty look like high standards. She would say she was being tough on me because she knew I could do better, because she believed in my potential. It sounded almost loving if you didn't listen too carefully. Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out a worn manila folder. "I kept everything," she said, sliding it across the desk to Dr. Williams. "Every essay she graded, every report card she signed, every note she wrote. I thought maybe someday I would need evidence." Dr. Williams opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of school papers covered in red ink, with comments that were far more savage than anything a teacher should ever write to a student. Lazy thinking. Lacks depth and originality. Perhaps you should consider that writing isn't your strength. And these were comments written to her own daughter. "Rebecca," Dr. Williams said carefully, "what finally made you decide to call me now?" "I saw Marcus Thompson's interview on the local news last week. When he talked about feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, about thinking maybe he really was stupid, it was like listening to my own voice from 23 years ago." Rebecca's voice broke. "I realized that my mother had been destroying children for decades, and I had stayed silent because I was still that terrified 12-year-old girl who just wanted her mommy to love her." The interview Rebecca was referring to had been part of a local news investigation into the Lincoln Middle School situation. Marcus, with his mother's support, had agreed to share his story publicly in hopes that other students might find the courage to speak up about their own experiences. The segment had been heartbreaking, but powerful, showing a poised young man who was slowly regaining his confidence while still bearing the emotional scars of his ordeal. "There's something else," Rebecca continued, "something I think you need to know about why my mother became the way she is." Dr. Williams waited, sensing that this revelation would be the final piece of a very disturbing puzzle. "My mother wasn't always cruel. When I was very young, maybe 5 or 6, she was different. Not warm exactly, but not deliberately harmful either. The change happened when my father left us." Rebecca's voice became distant, as if she were looking back through decades of pain. "He was an artist, a painter. He tried to make a living with his art, but it was never enough to support a family. My mother resented his unrealistic dreams and constantly pushed him to get a real job. When he finally left, she blamed his artistic nature for destroying our family." Dr. Williams began to understand the deeper psychology behind Mrs. Richardson's behavior. So when she encountered students like Marcus, students with artistic talents, "She saw my father," Rebecca finished. "She saw everything she blamed for her unhappiness and took it out on children who reminded her of him. Every creative student became a target for all the anger and resentment she had been carrying for decades. The revelation recontextualized everything they had learned about Mrs. Richardson's pattern of targeting artistic students. It wasn't random cruelty, it was deeply personal trauma being projected onto innocent children who had the misfortune to remind her of painful memories. "Rebecca, I can't imagine how difficult this has been for you," Dr. Williams said gently. "To watch your mother repeat this cycle with other children, knowing what you had endured." "I tried to intervene once," Rebecca admitted. "About 10 years ago, I heard through teacher networks that there were concerns about my mother's methods. I thought about coming forward then, but she was my only family left. I was afraid that if I spoke up, I would lose even the distant relationship we had managed to maintain." "What changed your mind now?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed Dr. Williams a photo of a young boy, maybe 7 years old, with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. "This is my son, Jake. He's in 2nd grade now, loves to draw, wants to be an artist when he grows up. In 5 years, he'll be old enough for middle school. And I realize that if I don't stop this cycle now, if I don't find the courage to speak up, someday he might end up in a classroom with a teacher like my mother. Maybe not her specifically, but someone just like her. Someone who was broken by life and decided to break children in return. The weight of Rebecca's decision hung heavy in the room. Doctor. Williams could see the cost of this revelation in the younger woman's face. The years of therapy it had probably taken to reach this point, the family relationships that would likely be destroyed by her honesty, the courage required to finally break free from a lifetime of psychological conditioning. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "With my mother, I mean." Dr. Williams chose her words carefully. "The school board meeting is scheduled for next week. Based on everything we've learned, I will be recommending immediate termination. Your testimony, combined with everything else we've documented, makes it clear that this pattern of behavior has been going on for much longer than we initially realized. Will you tell them about what I shared today? Only if you give me permission. But Rebecca, I think your voice could make a real difference. Not just in ensuring that your mother can't continue to harm students, but in helping people understand how this kind of behavior develops and persists." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the school playground where children laughed and played, blissfully unaware of the adult dramas swirling around them. "I'll testify," she said finally. "Those children deserve to have someone speak up for them the way no one ever spoke up for me." A week later, the Lincoln Middle School auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and community members who had come to witness the school board's final decision on the Richardson case. Sarah Thompson sat in the front row with Marcus beside her, both of them nervous but determined to see the process through to its conclusion. The testimony had been thorough and devastating. Dr. Williams presented her comprehensive report. Former students and parents shared their experiences, and finally, Rebecca Richardson took the podium to deliver the most powerful statement of the evening. "My name is Rebecca Richardson," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "Helena Richardson is my mother, and she was also my 7th grade English teacher. I want you to understand that the woman who systematically destroyed the confidence of your children has been practicing these techniques for over 30 years. I know, because I was her first victim." The auditorium was completely silent as Rebecca shared her story, painting a picture of generational trauma and explaining how personal pain had been transformed into professional cruelty. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The school board's decision was unanimous. Mrs. Helena Richardson's employment was terminated immediately. Her teaching certification would be reviewed by the state, and the district would implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, Sarah found herself face to face with Rebecca Richardson. The two women looked at each other for a moment, sharing the bond of those who had fought the same battle across different generations. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "What you did tonight, it took incredible courage." Rebecca smiled sadly. "No, Mrs. Thompson. What you did took courage. You saw your child suffering, and you fought back immediately. It took me 35 years to find that same strength." Marcus, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Ms. Richardson, what happened to your dad? The artist?" Rebecca's expression softened as she looked down at the boy, whose experience had finally motivated her to break her silence. "You know what, Marcus? I think it's time I tried to find out. I think maybe it's time I heard his side of the story." 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Rebecca Richardson. She had indeed found her father, now a successful gallery owner in Portland, who had never stopped wondering about the daughter he had been forced to leave behind. They were slowly rebuilding their relationship, and Rebecca had started a non-profit organization dedicated to training educators to recognize and address emotional abuse in schools. The letter also contained news about Mrs. Helena Richardson. Stripped of her teaching license and facing a future without the career that had defined her for 30 years, she had finally entered therapy to address the trauma and resentment that had driven her destructive behavior. It was a long overdue reckoning, but perhaps not too late for some measure of healing. Marcus had flourished under Mrs. Patterson's guidance, his confidence restored, and his love of learning rekindled. His artwork had been featured in a district-wide showcase, and he had been accepted into a summer program for gifted young artists. More importantly, he had learned that there were adults who would listen when he spoke up, and that his voice mattered. As Sarah finished reading Rebecca's letter, she reflected on how one moment of maternal courage had set in motion a chain of events that had changed multiple lives. The dramatic reversal that had begun with a simple decision to observe her son's classroom had ultimately revealed decades of hidden pain and started a healing process that would continue for years to come. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of love. A mother refusing to let her child suffer in silence, a daughter finally finding the courage to break a cycle of abuse, a community coming together to protect its most vulnerable members. In the end, that was the real lesson of the Richardson case, that transformation is always possible when people decide that the welfare of children matters more than the comfort of adults. Marcus was safe, Rebecca was free, and while Helena Richardson's story was far from over, it was no longer a story of unchecked power harming innocent children. The system had finally worked the way it was supposed to, and that, Sarah thought as she folded the letter and put it away, was a dramatic reversal worth fighting for. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming videos and more fascinating stories. Until next time.